Vasishta continued, O Ram, the mind, the intellect and the egosense, as also the senses, are all devoid of independent intelligence. Where then do the jiva and all the rest of it reside? Even as the moon is one, and yet it appears to be two or more on account of defective vision or agitation in the reflecting medium, the self, inner intelligence or consciousness, is one, but appears to be many on account of the agitation caused by the thoughts. A certain agitation of the thoughts inspired Sigmund Freud, the psychoanalyst, to understand the internal workings of the psyche in terms of three entities: the superego, the ego and the id. I don't think people were particularly concerned about whether these were real or not, or perhaps they assumed they were real. If so, where did they reside? I think the general understanding was that these three entities were notional. They gave us the basis of a story of individual human psyches, which some people would have found useful. Perhaps a lot of people didn't. But certainly the intention was that the stories based around superego, ego and id gave us a way of talking about things, of exploring things, and a way of understanding things. Perhaps for the better, perhaps for the worse. In the same way, we've got stories about mind, about intellect, about egosense, about the senses. And we need to understand that all these are simply notions which help us to tell stories. Stories which will be hopefully useful in certain ways. But what we often do is forget that they are stories. We forget that things like the mind, the intellect, ego sense, the senses, they've got no more reality than the superego, the ego and the id of Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis. And this is the message that we're being given here. Just as night comes to an end when darkness recedes, ignorance comes to an end when the poison of craving for pleasure ceases. And it's not just simply a craving for pleasure. That craving is for understanding. It's for stories. We've got this craving for stories. We often think that education is good, that understanding is good. But all we're doing is being told provisional stories which help us make our way in the world. Nothing wrong with that. But we need to understand that the bottom line is they are all stories. We're being fed a reality which is no more than notional. So that craving for pleasure can also be a craving for understanding, the pleasure of understanding. Understanding, or the feeling of understanding, is quite a pleasurable thing, isn't it? When the penny drops, when something clicks, when things click into place, when the story plots come together, there's something very satisfying about that, isn't there? And that's something which can be explored, which can be inquired into. This deadly virus of craving for pleasure is instantly cured by the magic formula of scriptural declarations. Well, magic formula, these are the mantras of scriptural declarations. Well, we can certainly find scriptural declarations useful, hopefully, as reminders, as pointers to our realization of truth. At the very instant when wickedness or foolishness comes to an end, the mind with all its retinue vanishes, even as pearls scatter when the connecting thread is broken. Well, we've got to be careful here. That occurrence does not necessarily happen when wickedness or foolishness comes to an end. It's not dependent on that. When it does happen, foolishness and wickedness comes to an end. Hence, O Ram, they who abandon the scriptures have chosen to live as worms and vermin for their own self-destruction. There's one or two not particularly pleasant passages coming up. I think we just have to take this, rather than as judging others, as reminding ourselves that we don't want to be sold shoddy goods. We want to be able to make the most of our human possibilities. So let's be careful about this, about being judgmental here. When wind subsides, the surface of the lake becomes calm once again. When agitation caused by ignorance ceases, the unsteadiness of the eyes, caused by infatuation for wife and other objects of pleasure, ceases. So sorry, wife, your husband's infatuation is a spiritual liability. The point is, though, unless you are an isolated person or quite an alienated sort of person, we live in a network of relationships. And sometimes this attitude of being free from relationships can appeal to rather emotionally disaffected people. I heard it said that if you ever really want to find out what somebody's like, see them when they're with their parents. There can be a tendency among so-called spiritual types to want to dismiss relationships, dismiss family. All that is the very stuff of what we have to deal with. And perhaps dismissing it is one way of dealing with it. But on the other hand, they can provide you with an opportunity to tell you something about yourself, something which has to be acknowledged before you can move on. So the whole thing about relationships, whether it's with wife or parents or lovers or whoever, is a very challenging one. Obviously, O Ram, you have reached that steadiness. You have listened intently to my words, and on account of that, the veil of ignorance has been lifted in you. Even ordinary human beings are profoundly influenced by the words of their family preceptor. How then can it be different in one who possesses an expanded vision as you do?